Ronnie Barenhoig with One Chiropractic and Dr. Richard Barwell from Neuro Infinity. Man, sorry about some of the technical issues we had the last session, but we're going to pick right back up in homeostasis to allostasis and kind of where we're at in that brain function. So, Doc, I'm going to let you kind of pick it up where you left off.
Okay. Well, fingers crossed for this time. If they only knew what was going on, it would be wonderful. Okay. Well, let's see if I hit share and see if we can get back to where we need to get back to. Yeah, we're there.
We're there.
Okay. Get that thing over there and leave it alone. All right. So we talked a bit about homeostasis and allostasis in the last one. I just want to go back and review this because I think that this is part of the shift that has to happen within the mindset of the chiropractor. We were taught about homeostasis when we were at chiropractic college. At least I was. I'm not sure about today. But homeostasis, it was a term that's used widely within the chiropractic profession. Matter of fact, you find it in a lot of the professions that are sort of adjacent to chiropractic, because that's a term that was not so much dealing with medicine, but dealing with an alternative approach. So we needed to understand what these words meant. Balance within. So let's take a look at this and see if we can get this thing to move without me messing it up. Look at that. Okay, homeostasis. It's a physiological process whereby the organism maintains a constant balance. That's within an internal environment. It stays at a certain point, and it runs the system so it maintains that ideal point where everything is working in harmony with one another, all the way down from the central nervous system to the systems of the body, to the organs in the body, to the cells within the organs, are at an ideal, beautiful spot that says this is how we maintain. The goal of homeostasis is to maintain a set point of body function down to that cellular level. And chiropractors really need to start thinking about the fact that they're dealing with cellular level function. We tend to just look at
right.
pains and aches when we're not paying attention to the fact that we actually change all the way down. When you change neurological function, you change it all the way down to a cellular level response. We sell ourselves very short. The goal of allostasis is to maintain optimal point in changing environment. You remember I talked about the changing environment, and I talked a bit about this in the last one before we ran into some issues. That changing environment is part of that universal intelligence that we talked about, where we live in an environment that is in constant change. So every nanosecond, it's going from one form to another form to another form, and we have to live in that area. Allostasis is more dynamic and adaptive process than the homeostasis. It allows us to adapt during that time of change going on around us, or even internally, because, while we're digesting food, for instance, as that food is being digested and being absorbed, that's a changing environment. And so we got an internal and an external environment that is in constant change that we need to adapt to. So it allows for functional efficiency during the states. That's what allostasis is all about. Allostasis response, increased arousal in response to a stressor via the three axes of how that nervous system works and how it gets information in and information out. And that affects all the way down. If you look at things like, for instance, pituitary, adrenal, we're talking about major function in the body. Pituitary controls the chemicals in the body. All those hormones, that's controlled by the pituitary. Our adrenals, that's our response to stressors at an acute level, a fast working level, and a slower working level. And then the vagus nerve, which is our resetter, which is the area that we can now start, the parasympathetic, so we start to regain a normal or ideal balance. So recovery from the stressor, and it says just as important, we talked a bit about that, it's coming out to the point where it's even more important than the response to it. So let's see where we go from here. We talked about this, and this is where we started to run into the problem. We have sensory input. It goes up to the brain, goes through all the cycles in the brain where all the parts of the brain are getting fed information, especially by the prefrontal cortex to say, okay, we got a problem here. We need to do something about this. It goes back and forth, comes up with the memory patterns off the cortex saying, have we ever been here before? What did we do before? Did it work or did it not work? It worked, let's do that. It didn't work, let's do something different. Or if it gets stuck in that pattern so badly, we reacted before like this, we're going to react the same way again. And then that information is going to get sent down to the limbic system, and we're going to have then the body chemistry, the body physiological, and the body emotional all reacting on that basis. Mm-hmm. So then we have the motor output that gets fed back up into the sensory system. All that is great. That's the way it's supposed to work ideally. If there's any interference in there, we got a problem. Well, the interference in there starts at a higher level. So allostatic load. This goes back to the processing resources in that article we talked about in that last series about brain economics. Allostatic load, or processing resource load, refers to the cumulative cost of the body of allostatic responses. How much can we take? How much input can the system take before the processing resources become overloaded because of the amount of changes going on internally and externally? The brain ability to appraise situation becomes impaired. Remember I said, even a small amount of stress affects the prefrontal cortex, the conductor of the brain. The minute you have problems at that level, you start to then build on those problems and it gets worse. It takes high energy consumption to deal with all of this. That's why we start getting stuck more and more and more into beta, because we're in defense all the time. And beta has huge demands to stay at that high frequency function at brain work. So what happens now is you start to put a stress on the system. We know this. Glucose is brain food. The brain needs glucose. I remember that when I was racing cars, and I would be out there for half an hour going full tilt boogie with my reticular activating system wide open, because my brain was saying, you're going to die if you don't get all the information here. And I'd come in at times and I'd have a tire mark down the side of my car where I rubbed up against another car and didn't realize that I was that close to them. Yeah. But it didn't dent the car. It just left rubber marks on it. And I would get out of the car after half an hour totally and completely exhausted, soaking wet and completely exhausted. And the first thing I wanted was some sort of glucose input, orange juice or something like that, so that I could get my brain function back up again. Just think about that. If we're like that in everyday life, what's happening there? Where does glucose come from? Comes from liver function to supply it. So that means the liver is kicked into big time making the glucose. And for those of you that don't know how that happens, you forgot about the Krebs cycle. And that probably put the fear of God into most of the chiropractors. They remember the test. But it's really important. The Krebs cycle is really important. And what happens then, if you get too much glucose going on, meanwhile, your pancreas is saying, hey, what are you doing? And it kicks into gear. And we wonder why type 2 diabetes is on a huge, huge increase, because our stress levels are killing us. Allostatic response effectiveness is decreased, so the ability to adapt now becomes decreased because of the overload of the processing resources and the true subluxation in the brain. It triggers, and this is right out of the research work, it triggers physiologic and psychological disorders. When the brain's not working right, you get physiological and psychological disorders. Well, that feeds back into the system. You want to talk about post-traumatic stress disorders? There it is. Yep. So it's so important we understand what the role that stress plays on the central nervous system. So it looks like this. Sensory input, only problem is that the brain isn't working right because it's gotten stuck in patterns, because it can't self-regulate. And so that pattern, now the integration isn't any good. And when the integration isn't any good, guess what happens? The output isn't any good. The motor response isn't any good. That affects the sensory input, which affects the integration, and we're in the downscale loop. The only way the subconscious that rules the entire brain function can tell you that you're in trouble is to create a sign or a symptom. But that happened long after this had already taken place.
Yep. That's crazy, man. I mean, it makes so much sense in our world when you break it down to this level. And it explains behavior patterns in our patients. It explains their response to the care that we provide. It explains why we need to see them the frequency that's appropriate based on their particular case. It explains why everyone responds a little bit differently to the adjustment. It explains, you know, because if it really was just bone on nerve, we should have very static responses, right? We should have a very controlled environment if it really was bone on nerve. But, you know, when we start getting to this level, it really starts explaining why there's such the varying responses to our care. And they're all amazing in their own right, but everyone's responding differently because of where they're at in their system and their sensory input and integration and motor output, and what those cycles are that they're burned into, and their psychological and physical responses to that stress, and even the type of stress that they're experiencing. Right?
And, you know, that's another key. The type of stress affects people differently.
Right.
And so that's why we needed to take a look at emotional and cognitive and physical stressors when we do the testing. We can't just, you can't just hook somebody up and sit them there. You need to take a look at how those stressors affect people and how they recovered from it. And so that's the key. And yet here's the thing that chiropractors have held themselves as to being above for years when they look at the medical profession saying, well, they just treat symptoms. We deal with cause. Sorry, if you're focused on vertebral subluxation, that's not the cause. The cause is here. And so we need to deal with that thing that we talk about, that stressors create vertebral subluxation. Well, then let's deal with stressors. Let's find out about how stressors do this and how the adjustment affects the reaction to those stressors. That's the true chiropractic. That's where we needed to have gone, and we sold our soul for money is what we did.
Yep. No, I agree.
And I think that's the end of this session on this one. This is a short and sweet one.
All right. Well, hey, but there's still a lot of good stuff, and I'm glad we had the technical issues so that we could rehash some of this information and make sure that people absorb it. So, man, it's getting good, and it's getting good, and I'm excited where we're headed, because now we're going to start substantiating some of this through the research that exists, and introducing some new people to our conversation so that we can start sharing. So just know to come, we're going to be talking to Dr. Heidi Havik. We're going to be talking to some practitioners that are in everyday practice that are using this information and what it's done in their practice and how it's changed the way that they're really functioning in their world. And the whole goal of this series, and I know it's been Dr. Barwell and I for a large chunk of this beginning, but we need that basis of understanding before we start introducing some application. And so I thank you for going through this series. Again, I'm going to ask you to keep referring this to your colleagues, keep spreading this across our profession, across the world, so that we can have a renaissance, if you will, in our profession for this new information. And I believe it's really not new. It's just getting better connected with how it all actually started before we kind of started putting what DD and Stevenson and BJ were talking about, but making sense in our minds rather than actually understanding where their headset was. So, Dr. Barwell, thank you again for your time and your effort on this. We appreciate it. And everyone, we love you. We thank you. Don't stop your search. Keep digging. Keep asking questions, and we're going to do our best to give you the answers. So God bless your day, and we'll talk to you tomorrow. See you. Bye.